So this talk will be by both our speakers, Jeremy Sammut, who most of you know pretty well, I think, most recently the author of the quite well-received and very well-received book on the madness of Australian child protection. We didn't publish it, but you can get it in your local bookshop. And then Anthony Daniels, Theodore Dalrymple. Most of you, a lot of you are here because you've read his articles over the years in The Spectator and elsewhere. He has a remarkable ability, as does Jeremy for that matter, to sort of see through things and come to the real tough issues that need sort of at least raising and so forth. They'll both talk for about 10 minutes and then we'll be over to you. So did you decide who's going first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Greg. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like again to thank the Centre for Independent Studies and, of course, Greg Lindsay for having invited me here to Australia. It's a great honour to have been the Max Hartwell Scholar, but as I keep saying on every occasion, I am not a scholar, unlike Max Hartwell, who was a real scholar. Well, so I'm going to just outline a few of the problems, and I'm not going to suggest any solutions. Jeremy is going to give you the solutions. Social revolutions are long in the making, and it's impossible to fix any precise date as to when they began. The intellectual preparation of the near destruction of the nuclear family in large parts of Western society, for example, was assiduous. And I should say that in the area in which I worked, it was almost unknown for a child to be born of a married mother and father. It was 100% illegitimacy, if I'm allowed to use that word still, apart from Indian immigrants. Marx, for example, saw the family as an oppressive institution that had to be destroyed before humanity achieved its total liberation and became fully human. He didn't explain what it was before the liberation, but anyway, that's what he thought, that we had to liberate ourselves from the family. And however, like many a reformer, in fact probably most reformers and social revolutionaries, Marx did not live his ideals. He was a good family man to the point of being a paterfamilias. Now, you may remember Ibsen, Henrik Ibsen's famous play, The Doll's House. Such, I presume that's a play that some of you might know. Such is Ibsen's dramatic skill that we fail to notice at the end of the play. In fact, I've never seen it alluded to, the fact that Nora abandons her 3 children at the end without a moment's hesitation or regret in the name of the pursuit of her own liberation, her own space, as it were. Nobody noticed that. And Ibsen held her up for our admiration, and she's been taken as a heroine ever since, as if her 3 children had imposed no moral obligation on her whatsoever. Of course, there was a real problem at the time with educated women feeling very frustrated, but the abandonment of 3 children is surely not the answer to that particular problem. Now, we, of course, live in a society in which men are far more likely to abandon their children than women. And, of course, not every separation leads to complete abandonment. But personally, I can't regard it as altogether a cause for celebration that in Britain, at any rate, a child has, by the end of its childhood, about twice the chance of having a television in its bedroom as of having his father or her father at home. So that television and the state and the stepfather, perhaps, or stepfathers, I should say, are father to the child. Well, while the majority of stepfathers are no doubt good people, the fact remains that they are statistically, and for very understandable reasons, many, many more times likely than biological fathers to abuse the children in their household, either physically or sexually or both. And this is especially true in the lower reaches of society where I practiced for a long time. Now, most spectators of the Doll's House will fail to reflect on the prosperous nature of the household that Nora leaves behind, which, of course, prosperity helps a little bit to reduce the effects of abandonment. But as we know, abandonment of children in our society is inversely proportional to their social class, and dare I say it, Australia is still a class society. I don't have all that much difficulty in seeing the social class of people in Australia. It's the rich who get the pleasure of social reform, which gives them the feeling, the nice warm feeling inside of generosity of spirit, but it's the poor who get the deleterious consequences. The same might be said of the spread of drugs through our society. I think there are many people here who would remember the propaganda in favour of the use of illicit drugs in the 1960s. You were enjoined to tune in, turn out, and drop out. Tune in, turn on, and drop out. And there was in all this a considerable admixture of what one might call the predominant ideology of our age, which in my view is Marie Antoinetteism. Marie Antoinette, you may recall, dressed up as a shepherdess in order to live a bucolic idyll for a few hours, but always returned, in fact never really left, her regal and aristocratic milieu. And it was a form of moral exhibitionism that showed she was far in advance of her times. In a way, she was the founder of much of our current way of thinking. Once again, there's been a long preparation for the belief in the supposedly liberating effects of illicit drugs. "Oh, just subtle and mighty opium," wrote Thomas de Quincey in 1820. He turned his own efforts to abandon opium into a romantically titanic struggle of the kind that would appeal to the self-aggrandizing romanticists of our society, for whom any titanic struggle was preferable to the humdrum workaday world of steady endeavour. Not a moment's thought, not a fraction of a second's thought, was given to the possible effect of widespread drug use on the poorest and most vulnerable section of our societies. Notwithstanding the propagandists' self-declared sympathy for the poor and the downtrodden, the actual effects of their self-indulgence, which they could mainly themselves escape, on those who were very poor and actually somewhat downtrodden, interested them not at all. And still the main advocates of the complete liberalization of the drug trade, so that all drugs are freely available to everyone, come from the same social group, namely that which can escape the consequences of their own advocacy. Well, the model of human relations that was proposed and the social reforms that went a long way to promoting it was one that was freed of convention, contract, and condemnation. Only consent was important, consent between consenting adults. Once the only thing that bound people together was the state of their affections or desires of the moment, the full beauty of the human personality would emerge. And what actually emerged, I can tell you, was not very beautiful. And it was the breakdown and chaos that I saw in the part of the city in which I worked. Now, of course, every mature person knows that families can be hell. And I doubt that there's a person, or at any rate many people in this room, who could not tell a horror story about his or her family or someone very closely associated with their family. And I know I certainly could. But in human affairs, the choice is not between hell on the one hand and heaven on the other, or perfection and unutterable misery. Our lives are permanently unsatisfactory in some manner or another, and to take only one very obvious example, commitment is something to something or somebody automatically, though voluntarily, precludes many other possibilities. And many people now want to keep their possibilities open for the rest of their lives, as if they were 7 years old. It is, of course, true that commitments are and were always broken because the flesh is weak, however willing is the spirit. But now we have reached the stage when the spirit is weak and the flesh is willing. And again, the results are not delightful to observe close up. Hypocrisy, said La Rochefoucauld, is a tribute that vice pays to virtue, but at least it knows the difference between the two. The only way that hypocrisy can be eliminated from human affairs, given that man is an imperfect creature, is to destroy the distinction between vice and virtue, to deny its existence, and to accept no standards at all. And that is precisely what so much intellectual activity of the past century has been concerned to do. In many cases, of course, this intellectual activity is pure humbug. It can go to astonishing lengths. I once shared a platform with a woman who was in favour of prostitution. She thought it was a jolly good thing. Or that's what she said. And I asked her whether she would like her own daughter to be a prostitute. And she said that she would not mind in the least. And I didn't believe her, of course. She said it only to appear unconventional or transgressive. And transgressive is a term of approval now. Transgression is in itself a virtue, no matter what is actually being transgressed. Incidentally, a change of terminology can have practical effects. Prostitution in the medical journals is now universally called sex work, as if it were just another form of employment. And very briefly in Germany, there was an unsuccessful attempt to force women in receipt of unemployment benefit to accept sex work as they were forced to accept, say, hospital cleaning, because it was just another form of employment. The attempt failed, of course, because there was an outcry, and everyone knows that sex work is rather different from most other categories of work. For example, hospital cleaning. But the significant thing is that the attempt was made. Now, you may ask yourself, what is the solution to the moral morass in which we find ourselves despite our immense prosperity compared to all other ages? And I think the first step is to support the work of the Centre for Independent Studies. But beyond that, I do not have the complete solution. Thank you.